Let's. Okay, Bob, it's all yours.
Thank you. And most of you I have the privilege of knowing, and I thank you for joining today, despite the fact that I'm leading and you know that. So I'm going to be dealing with grief. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a licensed grief counselor. If I were, I would not interchange the words grief and mourning. They are different. They have different meanings and implications, but I may use those interchangeably, and I hope you'll be gracious enough to remember that I'm more of a journalist than I am anyone who can talk about a counseling topic. I wrote this book. It is entitled Struggling Toward Hope, Life After the Death of a Spouse, about 20 years after Eleanor died. I never intended to write the book. I had been encouraged to write, but I said, no, I'm not sure I have anything to offer that others aren't already offering. But as I came to retirement, there were parts of my grief experience that I had not shared with Alabama Baptist. And Alabama Baptist had been gracious to me. So I decided to write a series of articles that would share some of the more intimate details. And I shared some things in those articles that I had not shared publicly outside of my family prior to that experience. The reaction was very positive to it all, and I was strongly encouraged to write the book, or at least to write my experiences. So I did. I wrote, the book has 5 areas. The first is struggling with death, which recounts the experience of Eleanor's death. Basically, while that does share some intimate details, and you may find something interesting in there, one might be my struggle with the possibility of suicide in those days. The best values are in the following chapter: struggling with change, and then struggling with faith, and then struggling with self-understanding. In the literature, I don't find a lot of information that's helpful with those areas. So I tried to take my 15 years in grief work following Eleanor's death, my readings and studies and seminars and speaking engagements, and pull all that stuff together to provide something that might be helpful to an individual who was facing the changes in life that death produces, or the struggles with faith, because everyone who experiences a death is going to deal with the ultimate questions of life. What kind of God do we serve? Is God responsible? Did God fail me? Where was God? Those kind of topics. And then self-understanding. Who am I now? Because in our marriages, we form an identity that is plural. And we use the we pronouns. But what happens when part of that couple dies? Have a different self-understanding. And that's hard to come by. And I tried to deal with some of the practical parts of that. I'll tell you at the beginning, I don't offer any firm answers. What I did was pull out material that I had used in my journal, the records I had kept. I went back and tried to illustrate some of the ways I struggled with the faith issues and some of the things I had written that might be helpful. Some of the practical questions I did offer some guidance with, like, what do you do with the clothes? And how do you rearrange the house and that kind of stuff? But that's another issue. So I hope the book has value. And so far, the people who have used it have said positive things about it. But it's a new experience for me, and I'm always uncomfortable with an ego that says, I've got something to share with you, or I've got some insights that are important enough for you to listen to. So I'm very hesitant about doing that, and that's part of my nervousness today. So enough about me. I'm going to lay that aside, and I'm going to move to the bibliography. And when I deal with a bibliography, I want to make sure that y'all are aware of a couple of websites, first of all. I hope you know the name Alan Wolfelt. Alan Wolfelt is the executive director, founder and director of the Center for Loss in Life Transitions, located in Fort Collins, Colorado. He is probably the leading authority right now in death and in grief ministries. More than 70 books, and he has one book that I've found helpful in my interims, and that is how to put meaning into a funeral service. It's been very helpful to me, and I commend that to you. Another website is Teresa Rando. Teresa Rando is the director for the Institute of the Study and Treatment of Loss in Rhode Island. This is a newer resource to me, and she deals mostly with complicated grief, very traumatic grief experiences. But if you get into some complicated situations, you might find that helpful. The grief group that I used, the program that the grief group used, of which I was a part, and which is widely used in this part of the country, the Southeast, is The 7 Steps by Elizabeth Neld. Elizabeth Neld outlines 7 steps in the grief process, or 7 stages of grief. And it's important to know these 7 stages, what the stages are, what the emotions are in each of those stages, what the major choice that the grieving person must make in those stages, and how the grief process works itself out. I'm not trying to imply that grief process is a straight line from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, so forth. I'm just saying there are some signposts along the way that are helpful to people. And if you know Elizabeth Neld's 7 steps, I think you would find that very helpful in understanding what grieving people are going through, whether it's death from a suicide, or death of a spouse, or death of a friend. I think it would be very helpful to you. So I commend Elizabeth Neld to you. Now, when you look up the stages of grief, you'll find 7 stages described in different ways. You'll find some of them have compressed it into 5 steps, some to 10. But if you look at them, they'll mostly reflect Neld's 7 stages of grief, or 7 steps in the grief process. So I would suggest to you that if you would look at that, you might find it helpful. I'll lay this aside again. And tell you that the book that was most helpful to me of any that I read was Viktor Frankel's book, Man in Search of Meaning. You know Viktor Frankel's book, you've read it, I'm sure. The first part is his story as an inmate in the Nazi prison camps. The second part is how he put his psychological principles together. The first part was most helpful to me, and one chapter particularly. Frankel wrote in that book that after being in the prison for a while, he was able to look into the eyes of his fellow inmates and determine if they would live or die. And he could do that with great precision. He wrote that if he could see in the eyes of an inmate a purpose for living, that inmate would find a way to survive no matter the circumstances. But if the inmate could not have a reason for living, that inmate was likely to die. That spoke to me. It spoke to me in part because the reason I turned away from suicide is that I had a reason for living. And it spoke to me again when I looked at some of the older couples that I have ministered to along the way and recognized that after one dies, it is not uncommon for the second to die within 2 years. And frequently that's because they have no reason for living. Their world has been so changed that they don't have purpose. I think that's an important insight. And I think that's important as we try to minister to people in grief as well. Of course, I reread C.S. Lewis and I reread John Claypool. And as I talked with people in my grief groups and in other places, I found those very popular. I did not find them specifically helpful. And I wondered, what was it about me that they did not speak to me as much as they spoke to other people? I reached a conclusion that's just my personal opinion. And that is that Lewis and Claypool both give voice to a lot of questions and issues about God and about the experience that most Christians can't verbalize. So when they read Lewis or they read John, they're living vicariously off of the words of the pages. Because here, something is being said that they feel, but they can't verbalize. They don't have permission to say it. And if that is true, and I have to emphasize if that is true, then it may mean that a lot of the people that we deal with in churches or whatever the situation are not being honest with themselves about the feelings and not being honest with us. And that only adds complications to the whole grieving process. And I think we need to be alert to that. And we need to be paying attention to it as we try and deal with those who are grieving. Now, I want to suggest that we try and learn some lessons from the book of Job. You see, when Job's friends heard of Job's losses, they went to be with him. And when they saw how catastrophic his losses were, they just sat silently beside him for 7 days. I think that's important. It's important that we take pastoral initiative and we go to people who are hurting. It's important that we don't wait until we're called or till somebody tells us to go, that we, as the representatives of the presence of God, go to people, take the initiative and go to them where they are hurting. I think that's important. We have to be faithful and positive reminders of God's presence in the midst of the worst of circumstances. And I want to suggest that that takes more than one phone call. Now, I remember some of my seminary friends who called me when Eleanor died. I could name some of them right now. I can tell you some of what they said. I appreciated that, still do. But there's a difference between that one phone call and companioning a person on the grief journey. God companions us on our journeys. And as representatives of God because of ministry, I believe we need to companion others. We need to sit with the suffering. That's vital, it seems to me. Job's friends got in trouble when they tried to tell Job why the catastrophes happened to him. I hope we learn from that. It's not our role to answer the why questions. Job's friends did not understand what had happened to Job. They reflected the best of learning and understanding and philosophy and everything else, but they were wrong. And no matter how gifted and insightful we are, none of us understand the wisdom of God. That's a humility that's forced on us as we grow. I think we need to recognize that. So in the midst of the dying process or right after death, it's much more important to say, I'm sorry. It's much more to be present. It's much more to remind them that God is with them, that he hasn't abandoned them despite the pain that they feel at the moment. I also would encourage that we keep the focus on the hurting person and not on ourselves. That's been a temptation for me, and I may be talking to me here and not to you. But so oftentimes when you go into a hurting situation, if we've had any similar feelings, my tendency at least, and I think of others, is to say, well, I understand, I've been there. Well, we've had similar experiences, but we haven't been where these people are. Relationships are unique. Individuals are unique. Circumstances are unique. So we don't need to say a whole lot about us. We just need to keep the focus on the person that we're trying to serve. If we companion the grieving, there's going to come a time when we're sitting together over a Coke or coffee or somewhere that we're going to talk about what I learned in my experience and what you learned in your experience. And we're going to be able to share that, encourage each other and learn from each other. But at the time of the death, the presence and the I'm sorry seem to me to be most important. Remember, those who are grieving are not at their best. You already know they're shocked, there's disbelief, there's denial, confusion, pain, perhaps exhaustion. They have trouble making rational decisions. Most things are emotional. And when things are stripped away from us, a tendency is to go back to the basic. Many people act emotionally like they would act as a child. So we have to give them lots of grace in the human interaction. Not let rudeness or snippiness or an unkind phrase become a turnoff to the ministry that we try and give to people. We have to give them lots of grace. Grieving people are often desperate. Have you ever heard someone say, God promised me it would be all right? In my story, I relate what I thought was a sign from God that Eleanor would be all right, but it was a desperate person grasping at straws, nothing to do with God, as it turned out. But when people pray for healing, or they fast and pray, or they believe it's going to be all right, and those things don't happen, those questions, those outcomes can impact the relationship to God. Where was God? Why didn't it happen? Death can drive people toward God or away from God. over time, as I said a while ago, you'll have time, all of us will have time to deal with the why questions. But early in the process, be there for folk. It seems to me that's most important. A lot of grace in the midst of their circumstances. Now, I want to also suggest that we give people permission to grieve. That may seem odd. I don't mean it to. But our culture doesn't embrace death. It denies death. We don't want a lot of sadness around us. We want to quickly move on and get on with life. That's hard for the grieving person. There's a relationship that I can't define between how much one loves and how much one grieves. I don't know what that relationship is. I know that one widow told me that if she knew how much it hurt to grieve her husband's death, she would have chosen not to love him in the first place because it was so painful for her right now. And we had another lady come into our grief group who said, it's a good thing the SOB died, because if he hadn't, I'd probably shot him. There wasn't much grief in that situation. But if you grieve, it's hard. It hurts. It takes time. And it is important. We've mentioned some of the emotions of grief. Guilt is one of them. A lot of people who survive will say, what if? I have. The morning we got in the taxi to leave our hotel in Durban, South Africa, to go to the airport to come home. And in South Africa, they drive on the left-hand side of the road. So I opened the door and Eleanor got in from the sidewalk. And I kept the door open and she looked up at me and I said, aren't you going to move over? And she didn't want to move over, but she did. And then she died after the accident from the place she sat. And I've asked myself countless times, if I had walked around the car and gotten in on the other side, might I have died instead of her? There are lots of examples of the what if. That's just one. And along with that, the guilt is the wrong person died. And I've said that for years. That Eleanor had more understanding of the family, that where our family was, she was more needed than I was. The wrong person died. And you'll hear that from the grieving people. You'll hear them say the wrong person died. You'll hear the grieving say, what if I had done this? And all of that traces back to the guilt we feel as survivors. Why me? Why am I still alive? And the one I loved is dead. Survivors lose a part of themselves. It's like losing a limb. I have mentioned earlier that our identity is as a couple. And when that's lopped off, you've got an open wound. Sometimes we say that death, that time heals. But the grief of a death never heals. It's always there. You can have an aroma that will bring back memories. You can hear a sound that will bring back memories. And they're as fresh as the day they happened originally. So you don't get over the death of somebody and the wound doesn't heal. I've come to say that you have to find a new sense of balance. That's one of the analogies that I use. A new sense of balance is part of the grieving process. Now, I've said grief is hard. And I said we have to give permission to grieve. This is a prejudice. I don't think our churches are very good at giving people permission to grieve, generally speaking. Society doesn't embrace public mourning except for some great noble folk. But for most of us, they want to just move on. And the church has gotten away from a time of public mourning where internal grief is expressed. And now we have celebration of life services. And we talk about all the good that person has done and what a great person that individual was. And thankfully, we affirm our Christian hope in the midst of all of that. But we almost leave in a celebratory atmosphere where we convey to those who are deeply grieving that their faith is weak if they would dare desire their loved one to be with them still rather than in heaven. I'm going to confess to y'all that the fact Eleanor was in heaven was not a great comfort to me in the first several months. What I grieved was where she was not, and she was not with me. Another analogy, we all know situations where a patient had to get stronger before they could take the medicine or do the therapy or have the surgery. Well, I had to get stronger in the grief process before the fact that Eleanor was with God could bring some comfort. But the fact that she was with God was never a question. So it was kind of almost irrelevant. What happened was she was not with me. I've talked to a lot of folk who have questioned if they really loved God weeks and months after the death because they still cried because their spouse wasn't with them. And the church said you should celebrate that the spouse is with God. Folks, that's not very helpful to the grieving. And I don't think it's true to our faith either. As I read 1 Thessalonians 4:13, it says, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. We grieve. Our grieving is tempered because we have hope, but we still grieve. And I believe the church needs to pay attention to the fact that we need to help people grieve and we need to help people mourn. We need to give permission for people to grieve. Now, grieving is hard. It's just flat out hard work. Grieving impacts the survivor physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, and spiritually. Eating patterns change. Sleeping patterns change. One can be anxious. Anger, fear, guilt, depression. All of these are common. One can stop caring about physical appearance. Apathy can replace initiative. Things that were once important can become unimportant. One can have trouble remembering or comprehending. I was back at the Alabama Baptist a couple of weeks after Eleanor died. And I would sit in front of my computer for hours and not know anything that happened. I would pick up news stories to read and to edit, and I could read them 5 or 6 times and not know what the first line said. You have trouble remembering. You have trouble comprehending. Your values change. Lifestyles can vary widely. I know more than one Christian brother that became rather prodigal in their actions after the death of a spouse. Physical reactions can be slower. Some information. Studies show that those in the early stages of grief are 5 times more likely to have accidents, including automobile accidents and home injuries, than other segments of the population. 5 times. And the Center for the Advancement of Health said bereaved individuals suffer elevated risk of depression, anxiety, and other psychiatric disorders, physical complaints, and infections. They have higher consultation rates with doctors, use more medication, are hospitalized more often, and have more days of disability. Death rate is higher among bereaved individuals, with suicide a major risk. When one suffers the death of a loved one, not just a spouse, but a loved one becomes a critical individual in lots of ways, including physically. And people in my grief group had these kind of accidents. It's not just paper, it's reality. Many people who are grieving say, am I going crazy? In fact, among grief counselors, practically all say that's the number one question they received. Am I going crazy? I can't remember, I can't function. I hear my spouse's voice, I see so-and-so off in the distance. What's wrong with me? And they're scared. When in reality, all of these things are normal. They're not going crazy. They're normal in the grief process. And most of us who try and walk and companion the people who are grieving don't know that. I tried to share with a group I was in Birmingham at the time, Birmingham Leadership Group, that grieving people have more accidents and injuries, and they need attention. And everybody laughed. Because after a week, all these folks come back to work. I find that rather odd. We tell people, don't make any major decisions during the first year after someone dies. But then we bring them back into the workplace and expect them to function fully after they've had a week of compassionate leave. More than a decade ago, the Wall Street Journal published a feature article titled, "Putting a Price Tag on Grief." The article said, workplace grief costs U.S. businesses over $75 billion a year in reduced productivity, increased errors, and accidents. That was 10 years ago. Imagine the cost now. And it's because employers, like society, like churches, often fail to appreciate the impact of grief, how hard it is, and what a toll it takes on individuals. I'm going to skip one section of this because it's getting too long. And I'm going to offer what I put down here as a to-do list. Got 6 things. One is to stay in touch with the grieving. The church is at its best, and John Claypool said this. He was the first I heard to say it. In a crisis situation, we come to people, we bring casseroles, we pray for people, we gather around them, we support them. But 2 weeks from now, there's somebody else with that. And 6 weeks from now, there's been 2 more. We don't have the resources to do companioning across the long term. But do you know how long it takes a grieving person to regain some sensitivities? To lose some of the numbness that you experience in death? You become emotionally numb, physically numb. You can't think properly. It takes weeks and months for that to wear off. And by 6 weeks, most churches have forgotten that somebody experienced a death 6 weeks ago. There's no one knocking on the door, and there aren't any cards coming, and there aren't any phone calls. And just when the grieving person is beginning to get in touch with some feelings coming back into the life, they're alone. It's important that the church learn how to stay in touch with the grieving and not make the one phone call or just stay with them till the week after the funeral. And I want to suggest that in some of these visits that we ask survivors to tell their stories. Survivors have the need to tell their stories. They need to say again that so-and-so was important to me, and here's how so-and-so was important to me and to others. Grieving people they find value when someone cares enough to listen to those stories. And when someone can relate back an experience with their departed loved one, that becomes something of value that the grieving hold on to. So ask people to tell their stories more than once. Listen to them and contribute and affirm if you can. I hope a question that leaves our vocabulary is, how are you doing? A grieving person is not going to say, well, let me tell you that I didn't sleep last night. Let me tell you that I've been having these nightmares. They're just going to say, I'm okay. I'm doing all right. And we think they are because we want them to do all right. We don't want to be burdened with somebody who's hurting. Forgive me if I'm making generalizations. I don't mean to be indicting anyone. But society generally just wants everybody to be okay so we can get on with life. But instead of asking general questions like, how are you doing? If we ask about, how are you sleeping? Tell me about your supper last night. What's your nutrition like? Are friends dropping by? Are you getting out? You see, the tendency of the grieving is to shut the blinds and close the door and let the world of darkness kind of sink in. And somebody's got to push that away. And that somebody is the church, the Sunday school class members, the pastor, others who care, who represent the presence of God. So if appropriate, be a catalyst. Get someone to take them to dinner. Get someone to come by and talk with them. Get someone to take them to the movies. Involve them with other people. Be a catalyst. And I would suggest that you encourage people to keep a record of their grief journey. I didn't do a good job with that. When I started, there's a place in front of our house that I labeled the Widower's Walk. And it's about 1.5 miles down and 1.5 miles back. And I would take that walk every day and I would talk out loud to God. I guess the people that I passed by thought I was crazy as I was talking out loud. But then I started writing. And one of the things I found is that a month later, if I look back at what I had written, I could tell there was a difference. But if I didn't have a touchstone back here, I would never know that there was a difference now because I was so absorbed with where I was at the moment. So keeping a journal, something that's a reference that helps you mark your journey, I think is important. It was important for me. And when appropriate, ask them about their relationship with God. Give them permission to voice all those feelings that they're having. And don't be put off by them. Let them tell you if they're angry with God. Let them tell you if they believe that God failed them. They want to know where God was when they were hurting. I'm not sure we'll all have satisfactory answers, if any of us will have satisfactory answers. But getting those things out in the open so they can be dealt with is important. As long as they stay unspoken, they're just going to fester and someday explode. Remember, the grief journey is not a straight line. It's like 1 step forward and 2 steps back. I was preaching one Sunday night at Pleasant Ridge Baptist Church, where I was interim pastor. It was about 12, 14 months after Eleanor died. And that night, right before I got up to preach, they sang a song, "Now I Belong to Jesus." And I came completely emotionally undone. Eleanor had a recurring dream for years. She would wake up in the dream in a casket, and she would beat on it and try to get out, and she couldn't. And then she would sing, "Now I Belong to Jesus." That night, all of that came back to me. And I was back in the emergency room of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, back in the critical care ward of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Durban, South Africa. Back at the grave, back at her side as the unhooked her and as she died. And it took a while. It took some days. It to work back through those emotions and cover the ground that I had covered in the previous year plus. Now, the good thing is that when you take a backward step, you don't fall as far back as you were originally. And you don't stay back there as long as you were originally. You recover and you go forward. But grief is a circuitous journey. It's not a straight line. And there are no time frames. You know, we say don't make any, I said this a while ago, don't make any decisions on the first year. But on day 366, you're a whole lot like you were on day 365. There are no magical timelines. And I found myself months later, a year later, in fact, saying, I don't deserve this. Why are you doing this, God? And I thought that had been settled in the first few days, because the answer was, why me? The answer, why not you? See, if you say, I don't deserve this, you're saying somebody else does deserve this. But that's not what God promises. God promises his presence. Issues that we think are nailed down come loose. And we sometimes fall back and we have to go through it again. That's just part of the process. Now for me, the faith questions are really important. And I hope that all of us are somewhat prepared, excuse me, I don't mean to be insulting, are prepared to deal with some of the issues. I've got more than I could present, but I'm going to stop with a reading from one of the things I wrote in my journal and I used in this book. And you'll forgive me, I trust, for sharing a writing, but the question I asked was, did evil win? And I introduced the question in 3 paragraphs. And then I pulled out what I wrote from my journal the night that I wrote this, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read what I wrote, a few paragraphs. While I do not understand the mystery between the sovereignty of God and the freedom of man, I am convinced that neither the accident on July 11 nor Eleanor's death 9 days later were part of God's perfect will for her. The God made known in Jesus Christ is a God of love. He is one who desires the best for us. He demonstrated that when Jesus died for our sins on Calvary. God does not work his perfect will through drivers racing through downtown streets or those ignoring traffic signals. He does not work his perfect will through exploding airplanes flown into buildings or angry body armored clad fanatics mowing down innocents with the latest automatic rifles. These are the result of evil. It is evil that has been in rebellion against God since the beginning of creation. It is the evil cast out of heaven to earth. That evil stalks the earth like a roaring lion, Scripture says, seeking those whom it may devour. Evil is a haughty spirit. It revels in the chaos and destruction that it wreaks in lives and in the world. Evil is a selfish spirit that causes people to act in ways that ignore the impact of their deeds on others. Evil is a rebellious spirit that considers only its own desires. Evil is a spirit that is against God and the community of saints. Evil is against what God intended at creation and recreated on the cross of Christ. Though this evil desires to replace God, It has already been judged. On that great judgment day, this evil will be cast out forever and ever. It will be punished for its rebellion against God and its work against mankind. This evil that caused the driver to ignore a red light and crash broadside into our taxi at more than 70 miles an hour set in motion a series of natural laws that eventually claimed Eleanor's life. Yes, these passed through the permissive will of God, but they were not God's perfect will for her. I am convinced that God's perfect will was for Eleanor to joy in the wonderful things happening in our lives. Our daughter and her family had moved to a nearby church. Our first grandchild, her service in the kingdom of God, our time together, and much more. God did not call Eleanor home. He did not say, "It is your time," or "I need another angel," or other such things we often put in God's mouth. But God was there to welcome her home, even when she arrived prior to his perfect will. Those are some paragraphs from that section. I tried to deal with them seriously, and that's where I was the night I wrote it. I have lots more that we could cover, but I'm going to stop there. Examples of changes that are necessary, examples of self-identity, self-understanding, examples of faith. But I've gone for an hour. I didn't know that. Gone for an hour. Let's deal with some questions if you have any, or we can just say goodnight and go home. Andy, you're in charge, I think.
Okay, who has a question for Bob?
I have a
Speak up
comment.
or comment.
Bob, thank you for your wisdom, your vulnerability, your honesty in sharing with us today. It is a gift. I intend to recommend your book to my students and want to know if you would give permission for us to ask students to view what you've done today, or if you would rather than simply read your book.
I wrote the book to be helpful. So whatever is helpful, I'm for. I'm not going to make a lot of money on this. That wasn't the intention. This is only a sampling. If this would encourage them to read the book, that would be great. Because while I referenced my suicide consideration, the book places that in context. And some things like that would be helpful. And thanks for considering it worthwhile. I appreciate that.
I have used both of those authors as textbooks. And I don't know if you can see me agreeing with you, but what you shared is so in line with what I've experienced with chaplains and training all these years. And it seems authentic. My one comment would be it's your particular story, and particularly in other cultures, African-American cultures, Asian cultures, grief might express itself differently and the needs might be a little different, but the journey is so familiar.
3 years ago, I keep forgetting about COVID. I was in Indonesia, and I was asked to work with a group of Indonesian pastors in Sumatra, the island of Sumatra, on grief. And I was very intimidated by that because of the difference in culture. As we spent time together and talked, I found that while there were cultural differences, the human process was very similar, even in Indonesia on Sumatra.
Bob, I appreciate your testimony too, and I'm going to get your book.
Well, thank you.
really sounds great. And I appreciate, I was a hospice chaplain for many years and did hundreds of funerals, many of whom I didn't know before, I was called at the last minute. So what you have said is very valid and really appreciate.
Thank you.
Another comment? Most of you are muted.
Bob, I'd just like to express my appreciation for all that you've shared. And I can identify with so much of what you've said, especially Alan Wolfelt. And his book that became very meaningful to me was Companioning the Bereaved.
Yes.
And I noticed you use that word so often throughout there. But I had one experience that underlines one thing you said. I volunteer at Baptist Hospital. In fact, that's where I am right now. And we had a lady from our church that was in the hospital. I didn't really know her, but I went by to visit her. And she said, well, I'd really like to volunteer when I get out. And I said, well, let me know when your doctor clears you and I'll introduce you to the volunteer director. So she did, and I went by to pick her up. And as I said, I didn't really know her well, and she was a widow, by the way. And when she got in my car, she said, Norm, she said, do you have times when you miss Martha terribly? And I thought, wow, what a way to start a conversation. And I said, yes, every morning, every night, and in between.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, after 23 years, there are still times when I miss my husband terribly. And I realized then, this was within a year after Martha had passed. I thought, well, that was a sacred moment for her. And it was also a lesson for me that the grief, even the terrible grief, never goes fully away.
Never does. And Norman Pat has put a book in the mail to you.
Yes, he told me. I'm looking forward to getting it.
I've also put a link in the chat session with the Amazon link if somebody wants to follow that to get a copy. Okay, other comments, questions? Wallace Williams has joined us somewhere. I haven't seen him, but I guess he's there. Wallace, do you have any questions, comments?
I'd like to add one more thing.
Sure.
In the grief journey, we're told that the journey you have to make is from a physical presence to a memory. That's the longest journey I've ever made because I'm still making it. Because we try and hold on to the physical presence because that's what we've known and appreciated.
May I help you, please?
And that journey, you have to bring in, what do you do with the clothes? What do you do with the house? How do you rearrange things? Your whole lifestyle, all of that gets involved in that journey from the physical presence to the memory. But if you don't make that journey, if you don't do the grief work, you're going to end up stuck somewhere. You're going to be neurotic and you're never going to make progress, and life is never going to be the same if you don't make the grief journey. I said the same, let me clarify. Not like it was when your spouse was alive, but reconstructive and positive and worthwhile and worth living. A new reality for you. Some folks hide down behind a rock from the storms of grief, and they stay there stuck all their lives and they become neurotic. And if you do that, you are condemning yourself. You don't have a purpose for living. And like Frankel said, you're just going to die there. But if you have a purpose for living, if you get up, put your face into the storm and just walk on, you're going to get through that storm and you're going to find wholeness that God will bring to you in a new sense with a new purpose. So walk through the storm.
Can you hear me?
referenced the grief
Can you
group.
hear me okay?
Yes, Chuck.
I want, before I have to leave, I want to echo what others have said, and that is to express my gratitude to you for sharing this. This was so meaningful. Grief comes in a variety of ways. In 1983, our 10-year-old son was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor.
Oh,
He survived. He will turn 50 this July. And I attempted to write a couple of things with regard to the kind of grief, that enters our lives, where it's something that stays with us. Because at the time that David was diagnosed, obviously he was the focus of everything in our family.
mhm.
Our daughter was 13 years old, which it would be a hard time for any child, but that would be a very difficult time. And Diane and I, had to mobilize to get surgery and treatment at the dislocation of being somewhere else. But so much of what you said speaks so deeply to me. I think what you said about when something like this happens, for us to survive, we've got to really reframe life. It's not going to go back to what it was. And believe me, I went through the time of asking why God, why is this happening? As Harold Kushner, why is this happening to us? Why is it happening to anybody? That type of thing. But it's obvious whatever source of grief in our lives, it stays with us and shapes us. But I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chuck. Wade.
You're muted, Wade.
Bob, you had several references to a grief group, my grief group, the
Yeah.
grief group.
Yeah.
And we've had some grief groups at St. Matthew's. A lot of hospice groups have grief groups. And some of our St. Matthew's members have said, I prefer to grieve with people who knew my spouse rather than to grieve with a group of strangers. In your book, do you deal with the use of grief groups, the importance of training grief leaders? I think every church should have a grief group that meets once a year, if not all the time.
Yeah.
What can you say about that?
Well, first of all, here in Birmingham, we have what's called community grief services. And this organization is a 501c3 group. It's not a religious group per se, although mostly religious people are the ones who run it. The grief group, the community grief, has grief groups by nature of loss. There's a difference between losing a child, between losing a spouse, or losing a parent. The dynamics are different. So my experience, so we have grief groups for those who lose a parent or sibling. We have a group for those who lose an adult child. We have those who lose a spouse, and we say working, because there's a difference between out of season losses and in-season losses. I'm not trying to say that they're any easier to live through, but some of the dynamics are different. So we have those various groups. We have found that when you put mixed loss together, it doesn't do as well because the dynamics are so different. But when you're sitting with a group of 10 people who have all lost a spouse in a similar time frame, you're all on a similar journey. You've had similar experiences in that journey. And we speak to one another with understanding, and we hear one another with compassion. Yes, the value of someone who knew Eleanor, I cherish that when they tell me the stories, but they don't know the grief. They've had a different kind of loss than I have. And their input and their encouragement is necessary for me. But the help of people who are walking similarly provides strength for the journey that others cannot. So I would say to anyone at St. Matthew's who says, I want people around me who knew my spouse. That's great. They're going to encourage you, but they're not going to help you deal with your problems, the issues of grief. Does that help in any way?
That's very, very helpful. Can you also speak to how you train companions? The Roman Catholic Church has companion training, and we've had many different approaches to training lay people to do care. But do you have a particular recommendation of how a church goes about equipping each other to be companions? Because the pastor, if you companion for an hour every week with just a few of the grieving people, there's nothing else she or he can do.
No. A couple of things at that point. Let me say as a general statement, most churches aren't interested in forming a grief ministry because it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. So they will talk about it, but it will fail in the first 6 weeks. That's been our experience. So where we start is that we offer to go into a neighborhood and offer a grief group for churches. We'll do it for a single church, and we'll offer once a year for a spousal loss. We'll offer every 2 years for the loss of adult child, something like that. And then those people that go through our group, then we try and enlist to help offer care in the local church because they've experienced some of it. And we have training sessions. I mean, we periodically have day-long training sessions, but not extended training sessions. But we focus mostly with people who've gone through this. The Stephen ministry is a great idea. That's fantastic, but even the Stephen ministry approach can't touch being helped and companioned by someone who's been on the grief journey.
Someone else?
But thank you all for being kind enough to listen and participate, and thank you for your feedback. I'm grateful for that.
And thank you, Bob, for being with us today and participating. You've certainly given us some wonderful things to think about in this time. Any other comments before we go?
Here, sorry I'm late on this. Great job. You're a splendid writer, and I've appreciated your ministry through the Alabama Baptist many, many times. And I remember your freshness in dealing with that. I think we even had lunch together one time.
Yes, Wallace.
But what you just said and the majesty with which you said it and the pointedness and the depth are just a wonderful combination. And I'm sure will be helpful to many. I look forward to your book, and I'll be a purchaser of many copies. I think there's hardly anything in the world, in my view, that makes us think more clearly about who we are, what we are, who Christ is, who is God, why are we doing what we're doing. It's such a depth of experience that never leaves, and it has to be evaluated and probably changed a lot as we move through life. We're looking for ways to put it together. But you also handled it beautifully, and thank you for that. And your speaking of it, and it sounds like to me you've been in these grief groups almost continuously since Eleanor's death. Is that right? Working with them.
I've been working with them. The grief group itself was an 11-week program, meeting once a week for an evening, about 3 hours. That included dinner. But then after that, a few months later, I was invited to go to the board. And so I worked for 15 years on the board, as well as went through the process and that kind of thing. Yeah. So.
What an important contact with the realities of life and existence. And well done, good and faithful servant. And if I can make a plug for C.S. Lewis, he wrote a very fine book on grief, A Grief Observed. And when he wrote it, he had to put an anonymous name on it, and Nat Welk, which means I know not who. And the press used it a lot. And the Anglican Church was afraid of it. It was so deep and it was so heavy and straightforward. It had a lot of the heaviness and forwardness of it that I could hear you speak with. And only after a while did they finally rejoice in it. And it's now one of their best books of circulation, as you can imagine. And he just writes so well, like you, a good experienced writer, and expresses so deeply what he's gone through. So anyway, thanks, Bob, and blessings on you and your work right now. I can't think of anything better. And it's a pretty good credit to say that Baptist editors are human beings and can work like human beings and get up close to them and be vulnerable. And you've done that. Blessings on you, Bob.
You're very kind, Wallace. Blessings to you and Judith.
Bob, I have one more suggestion.
Yeah.
Or question. You mentioned this is a 501(c)(3) in Birmingham.
Yes.
And you talked about the importance of a purpose, and you've been on the board, and you've obviously found meaning in doing this. Have you in Birmingham found a way or applied for a grant to teach other cities to do this in other neighborhoods? And
No, sir, we
I don't know
haven't.
if it would be a government grant, if it would be a Lilly grant, but to develop a model. I remember someone on the Sunday school board 30 years ago saying, our churches are dying because when we get something really good, no one wants to find a way to franchise.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you to talk to your board and think about what it would take to train other people in other communities to do what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, I don't know if it would be the Council of Churches. I don't know enough about what you're doing to be specific, but I really think it would be worth bringing it to other communities.
Thank you. If y'all find what I said helpful, if you find the book helpful, please suggest it to other people. The publisher that I used was a small publisher. They did no advertising. I just said, I'm not going to, if somebody else doesn't find value in this, I'm not going to publish it. It's not going to be a self-published kind of thing. I don't need that for my ego to be stroked. But somebody published it, but they didn't do any publicity. If you find value in it and can recommend it to somebody, I would appreciate it.
I have two responses to that. Wayne Oates told me early on, any fool can write a book.
Yeah.
It takes a genius to sell it. And the second response I have to that is I would encourage you to get on national media or to make yourself available in a wider circle, because the real way to sell this book is the story you've shared with us.
That's right.
Amen.
And I know you're a humble person and you don't, it's hard to get out there and do that. But I hope you won't keep that light under a bushel.
I really don't know how to do that, Wade.
The other suggestion would be, and by the way, this has been a fantastic hour for me. Zoom is a good instrument. It would not be difficult to develop a 7 or 8 or 10 or 11 week training session via Zoom that churches could plug into and develop these kind of ministries. What you've done, we need to do in our church.
Yeah.
It's been a fantastic presentation.
Same.
Thank you. I'd be glad to help anybody that wants to. Because, you know, as I said, my idea is to help people. I know how the hurt is. And if I can help people who are hurting, I'm glad to do that.
Yeah.
Amen.
Okay, thank you, Bob. We appreciate your time today, and I've posted a link to where this will be on YouTube later after it's downloaded and re-uploaded to YouTube, so people can see it again, or they can forward the link to people that might find it beneficial. So thanks again for being here, and thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month with another person. I'm not sure who's up next month, but I'm sure we'll find out soon from David. Again, thanks, Bob.
Bye-bye. God bless.
God bless.